Lacan begins Lecture 6 with a question. What is the function of the ego? And he comes right out and answers it. Its function is misunderstanding. Lacan subsequently spends much of the lecture discussing portrayals of the ego by two leading psychoanalytic theorists, Anna Freud and Melanie Klein. For Anna Freud, the ego manifests through defenses and in opposing the work of analysis. And at the same time, Lacan claims she takes an intellectualist position in which analysis must be conducted from the position of the ego. As such, her portrayal of the ego appears to vacillate between different functions. On the one hand, that of misunderstanding, and on the other, that of an autonomous agent. Melanie Klein opposes this portrayal. For Klein, a sort of ego is already present at birth or shortly thereafter. This ego appears in transitory identifications with objects. However, such identifications are marked by an anxiety that prevents them from becoming definitive. In other words, there is no resting place where the ego can lay its head. This leads to a failure in acquiring any kind of fixed reality. Lacan notes what he perceives as Klein's incomplete theory of the ego, but also praises her for having shown how objects appear through a process of expulsion that is connected to our primitive destructive drive. We also get some interesting theoretical nuggets from Lacan in this lecture worth mentioning here, and they shed light on Lacan's analysis of a case study originally provided by Melanie Klein of a boy who resides in an unstructured, undifferentiated reality. In this case, the boy has not assumed language, has not affirmed a signifier. He can use signifiers, certainly, just as for Klein there are transitory identifications with objects, but these signifiers acquire no fixed meaning, a meaning that can only be acquired through the installation of a symbolic order. And to understand how the symbolic functions here, we must consider it in light of two other registers, that of the imaginary and real, which together with the symbolic form the fundamental schema that will guide Lacan's theoretical and clinical discussions throughout these seminars. The symbolic imposes structure and order upon that which resists symbolization absolutely, the real. The real is that which cannot be directly spoken of or even experienced, but it achieves the height of its manifestation only as an externalized, hallucinated reality, that is, through the imaginary. Finally, I want to make mention of a passing comment by Lacan in which he briefly articulates how this installation of the symbolic is what leads to the realization of the subject, of the id, and of the unconscious. We should pause for a moment and note that the subject, the unconscious, and the id are all being equated here and fall under the symbolic. It took me a while to realize that Lacan does not place the id in the real, but in the symbolic, and that despite common interpretations of Freud, the unconscious does not consist of a set of unorganized drives, at least according to Lacan. We'll have to leave it an open question right now as to how this is the case. This completes section 1 of seminar 1, entitled The Moment of Resistance. I want to briefly summarize some major ideas from this section. Resistance is an obstacle to analysis, representing a breaking of the fundamental rule of free association. As such, moments of resistance are the points at which speech no longer reveals the truth of the unconscious and instead degrades into empty speech, where ego relates to ego, where each thinks they understand the other. And rather than such resistance being solely the responsibility of the analysand, it is the analyst that is perhaps the principal form of resistance, basing interpretation on the here and now, on the intentions of the analysand's discourse, and basing it on countertransference. Instead, psychoanalysis requires going beyond a two-person psychology to include a third term, the unconscious. The unconscious does not belong to the analysand, but is the history of the other living through the subject. Psychoanalysis aims at the reconstitution of this history and in the analysand's taking responsibility for it, that is, taking responsibility for what one is not. Interpretation, with this understanding of psychoanalysis, is not based on the here and now, but rather is informed by full speech, expressed in moments of failure, in misplaced and displaced signifiers. These failures reveal the truth of the unconscious. Interpretation also aims at disrupting empty speech, to get the analysand to problematize the subject's relation to itself, something that's often covered over by the imaginary. We will next transition to Section 2 of Seminar 1, entitled The Topic of the Imaginary. I'll see you next time.